Some of the most destructive pandemics the world has ever seen. Plagues and epidemics have ravaged humanity throughout its existence, often changing the course of history. Scientists and medical researchers have, for years, differed over the exact definition of a pandemic. But one thing everyone agrees on is that the word describes the widespread occurrence of diseases in excess of what might normally be expected in a geographical region. And here are some of the pandemics the world has seen and faced. Prehistoric epidemic, circa 3000 BC. About 5,000 years ago, an epidemic wiped out a prehistoric village in China. The bodies of the dead were stuffed inside a house that was later burned down. No age group was spared, as the skeletons of juveniles, young adults, and middle-aged people were found inside the house. Plague of Athens, 430 BC. Around 430 BC, not long after a war between Athens and Sparta began, an epidemic ravaged the people of Athens and lasted for 5 years. Some estimates put the death toll as high as 100,000 people. The Greek historian Thucydides wrote that people in good health were all of a sudden attacked by violent heats in the head and redness and inflammation in the eyes. The inward parts, such as the throat or tongue, becoming bloody and emitting an unnatural and fatigued breath. Nobody really knows what the cause of the epidemic was, and it has for a long time been researched. And a number of diseases have been put forward as possibilities, including typhoid fever and Ebola. Many scholars believe that overcrowding caused by the war exacerbated the epidemic. Plague of Cyprian, AD 250 to 271. Named after Saint Cyprian, a bishop of Carthage who described the epidemic as signaling the end of the world, the plague of Cyprian is estimated to have killed 5,000 people a day in Rome alone. In 2014, archaeologists in Luxor found what appears to be a mass burial site of plague victims. Their bodies were covered with a thick layer of lime, which was used as a disinfectant. Archaeologists found 3 kilns used to manufacture lime and the remains of plague victims buried in a giant bonfire. Flu pandemic of 1968. A Category 2 flu pandemic, sometimes referred to as the Hong Kong flu. The 1968 flu pandemic was caused by the H3N2 strain of the influenza A virus, a genetic offshoot of the H2N2 subtype. From the first reported case on July 13, 1968, in Hong Kong, it took only 17 days before outbreaks of the virus were reported in Singapore and Vietnam, and within 3 months had spread to the Philippines, India, Australia, Europe, and the United States. While the 1968 pandemic had a comparatively low mortality rate, it still leads to the deaths of more than 1 million people, including 500,000 residents of Hong Kong. 6th cholera pandemic, 1910 to 1911. The 6th cholera pandemic originated in India, where it killed over 800,000, before spreading to the Middle East, North Africa, Eastern Europe, and Russia. The 6th cholera pandemic was also the source of the last American outbreak of cholera. American health authorities, having learned from the past, quickly sought to isolate the infected, and in the end, only 11 deaths occurred in the US. By 1923, cholera cases had been cut down dramatically, although it was still a constant in India. Kokolitli epidemic, 1545 to 1548. The infection that caused the Coccolizli epidemic was a form of viral hemorrhagic fever that killed 15 million inhabitants of Mexico and Central America. Among a population already weakened by extreme drought, the disease proved to be utterly catastrophic. Coccolizli is the Aztec word for pest. A recent study that examined DNA from the skeletons of victims found that they were infected with a subspecies of Salmonella known as S. paratyphi C, which causes enteric fever, a category of fever that includes typhoid. Enteric fever can cause high fever, dehydration, and gastrointestinal problems, and is still a major health threat today. HIV/AIDS pandemic 2005 to 2012. First identified in the Democratic Republic of the Congo in 1976, HIV/AIDS has truly proved itself as a global pandemic, killing more than 36 million people since 1981. Currently, there are between 31 and 35 million people living with HIV. The vast majority of those are in sub-Saharan Africa, where 5% of the population is infected. That's roughly 21 million people. As awareness has grown, new treatments have been developed that make HIV far more manageable, and many of those infected go on to lead productive lives. Between 2005 and 2012, the annual global deaths from HIV/AIDS dropped from 2.2 million to 1.6 million. The Black Death, 1346 to 1353. From the year 1346 to 1353, an outbreak of the plague ravaged Europe, Africa, and Asia, with an estimated death toll between 75 and 200 million people. Thought to have originated in Asia, the plague most likely jumped continents via the fleas living on the rats that so frequently lived aboard merchant ships. Ports, being major urban centers at the time, were the perfect breeding ground for the rats and fleas, and thus the insidious bacterium flourished, devastating 3 continents in its wake. COVID-19. Obviously, you knew I was finally gonna come to this, right? The big bad stay safe virus that led us all to quarantine. Beginning in December 2019, in the region of Wuhan, China, a new virus, coronavirus, began appearing in human beings. It has been named COVID-19, which is short for coronavirus disease of 2019. This new virus spreads incredibly quickly between people. Due to its newness, no one on Earth has immunity to COVID-19 because no one had COVID-19 until 2019. While it was initially seen to be an epidemic in China, the virus spread worldwide within months. The World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic in March, and by the end of that month, the world saw more than 500,000 people infected and nearly 30,000 deaths. The infection rate in the US and other nations was still spiking. With the coronavirus pandemic, people all over the world have become more aware of the best practices during a pandemic, ranging from careful hand washing to social distancing. Countries across the world declared mandatory stay-at-home measures, closing schools, businesses, and public places. Dozens of companies and many more independent researchers began working on tests, treatments, and vaccines. The push for the human race to survive the pandemic became the primary concern in the world. The outcome of the COVID-19 pandemic is impossible to predict. At the time of making this video, we can learn from pandemics in history to determine our best courses. These are our teachers: the Spanish flu, the AIDS pandemic, and many more. They might slow down economic progression, but understanding and overcoming them is a step into a new form of knowledge. Be safe, everybody, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.